Welcome to the Green Ring and thanks for watching. We finally made it. This video is first in a series of 9 presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold Scene 4. That may seem like a lot of videos, but it's in this final scene all the work's conceptual syntactic elements come together as they propel this first chapter of the drama towards its mighty conclusion. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, this massive journey aspires to examine the entirety of Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me, one I'm dedicated to completing. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one. We pick up where we left off as Scene 4 begins, Dover's full score on the first stave of page 217, Wotan and Loge depositing Alberich on the mountaintop across from the newly built Valhalla. The moment they settle, strings and opposing demi-semiquaver scales racing to a staccato crotchet, a kind of plop, Loge resumes his taunts for the dwarf, no longer disguised as praise, but, though still merry, contemptuously barbed. His brief diatribe launches on an a cappella phrase, bouncing up a third into a new variant of his earlier claim for reliability, with its unique concatenation of Alberich's defiance and frustration. This time, however, the launch of its defiant module through an upward bounce of a third is a Welterbe triad. To emphasize the frustration module applies to the dwarf's hopes for racially dominating the world, a biting string quaverchord punctuating it. The fire god points across the valley. Luge, Liebster, dort liegt die Welt, die du Lugerer gewinnen du willst. As strings repeat 2 reversals of the Erde chords, their underlying irony being they also sketch the initial dragon module. The fire god's vocal intoning these words, while importantly revealing, is discussed when its repercussions appear in due course. Following it, the vocal etches his chord note module atop the morphine's decelerated chromatic string harmonies, which recall the previous interlude and constitute yet another embryonic strophe of Magic Sleep, per Cook, a product of Loge's chromatics. Though Magic Sleep won't appear definitively until Valkyr, its growth here is firmly allied to Erda, the fire god, and the world in general. More than Wotan, these are Alberich's true foes, whom he has offended and who covertly advance their long-lasting revenge. The fire god sings his final taunt to a syntactic bundle never heard again outside this scene, yet whose elements, like those of the previous interlude, continuously evolve until the tetralogy's conclusion. Loge, the one character who introduces comic elements into a work of almost unrelenting seriousness, exults over the dwarf's capture with giddy lightheartedness. Loge dances around Alberich, snapping his fingers. Begun on mostly staccato strings, much of this brief passage seems new, from the fire god's vocal repeated like a folk song to the courtly little grace turns accompanying it. Not surprisingly, its most recognizable syntactic moment consists of the extended Erda melody notes that end his vocal. This inspires strings to a unique cell hopping up fourths, grace turns, and first violins resembling the earlier ones, and borne atop a spear-like cello bass. An echo of Loge's vocal melody notes conclude the module, leading to a repetition of the fire god's vocal on woodwinds over cello's violins outlining his chord note syntax. Aptly, strings woodwinds cap it with the final Loge portion of Arrogance, piccolo's taking its melodies, remaining woodwinds strings, its Erda chords, to suggest this variant is a close cousin of those earlier taunts. Perhaps most intriguingly, the fire god's repeating figures, which the orchestral coda then develops, revolve around distorted cribs of that cell with the sense of the ring's allure, their falling-rising movement reversed, as if to telegraph Alberich's approaching loss of his bauble. This short passage's mood, quite unlike anything heard up to now in Rheingold, can't help but make an impression, and other aspects of its syntactic matter aren't entirely without precedent, though arranged in slightly different ways. Looking back to Scene 3, Alberich taunts Loge with a syntactic bundle whose elements return slyly here, if differently organized, as the fire god gets his own back on the dwarf. Alberich's idiosyncratic vocal turn there gives Loge the fodder to grossly exaggerate it here, while the dwarf's prior use of extended melody notes here repeatedly invests the fire god's revenge on him. Even Loge's signature module and air chords have their say in Alberich's earlier taunts. While these two passages are minor enough in and of themselves, like the cryptic syntactic details in the Scene 3-4 interlude, they extend their influence in unexpected ways through Siegfried and finally into Götterdämmerung. Loge's taunts also initiate the first in a series of quasi-recitative passages running through Scene 4's colloquy over hoard and ring, its vocals judiciously peppered with syntax, this first phase mostly supported by the string choir alone. Alberich demands his release with stinging invective, his vocal begun after a static ash interval on a series of chord note pulses, separated by dot and quaver rests and punctuated with staccato chord stings, a line reminiscent of his Scene 3 taunts for the fire god, going on to cry, "Löse den Bast, binde mich los." He echoes a pair of his defiant threats, their ends truncated to reverse chord notes, the first of which strings underline with air chords, the second initiating that turn figure from Loge's Scene 2 advice to Wotan, on marcato string quavers. At its crest, the dwarf intones static notes to continue, emphasized by a forte-piano string minim by leaping up a third into that ironic version of Freya's Love Cell, which both he and Loge have bandied in Scene 3. Strings answer with a noble cadential figure on two minims and a breve outlining the dragon in first violins as low strings support with reverse melody notes. This reverberation of a syntactic bundle from the Scene 3-4 interlude is particularly eerie since its unreliable dignity introduces the triumphant Wotan, who, now safe in the heights, regains his voice with a vengeance. Appropriately enough, he meets Alberich's demands on an inversion of the heroic melody notes to words which rehearse the dwarf's powerlessness atop suitably regal breve and semi-breve legato string chords, which still have the feel of empty rhetoric. His voice moves through an extended repeat of Loge's theft advice, which resembles the giant turn, separated at its valley by a crotchet rest, then leaps up a third into a third bounce, completing it with that module suggesting the ring's allure, a line whose falling portion also includes two ominous inverted ash intervals, as he describes that life the dwarf vainly hopes to conquer. His vocal expands this idea with syntax which goes by so quickly it might easily be missed, though it contributes to the work's morphemic evolution. Over string chording, the god's vocal rises on melody notes to fall through an inverted ash interval on the Welterbe triad, born from the ring itself, which has come to suggest that very racial change altering the Nibelungs through the ring's influence, at which the fire god hints to Wotan in Scene 2, something the immortal notices for himself during his visit to the underworld. Here, its initial falling third, completing the melody notes as a chagrin pulse, it subtly implies not only that Alberich's capture is per nature's design, but that the dwarf's racial loss becomes Wotan's gain. After a dotted crotchet rest, the god crows over the Nibelung tyrant bound helplessly at his feet, voice bouncing up and down air de force to continue on reverse melody notes that urge to racial domination they both share. Then, to follow a crotchet rest, both vocal and strings trace a shadow of resignation, the pathetic rising sixth at its conclusion making it a heroic strophe as well, one capped by chord notes. After another dotted crotchet rest, his demand for ransom lifts a third into a crib on Loge's recent taunt, again finished in chord notes. A quaver rest separates the line from its next chord notes, making a sly reiteration of the reverse melody notes as Wotan crowns his demand with chagrin, Lösung on its falling octave. The fuming dwarf curses his own folly, voice falling in another series of air to chord notes, fraught with static triplets that add up to an ironic spear twilight-like scale, all punctuated with equally downward marching marcato chords, yet another odd echo of his similar taunt for Loge in Scene 3. While this includes the traditional ideas of woe and servitude, it also subtly hints that Erda's world-shaping dreams intend this outcome from the beginning, while also subtly telegraphing Wotan's coming downfall into the bargain. After brusque static notes, Alberich threatens revenge to a prescient falling seventh, one of his few, another reflection of the Earth Mother's plans, atop a single pulse in strings of chord notes, to finish his threat by echoing Wotan with the module of heroic resistance. Alberich will be revenged, and by this very morphine, but not at all in the way he thinks. A forte-piano bundle of a quaver and minim chord rising a tritone punctuates the dwarf's menace, diffused as Loge hops in to emphasize the previous syntax's paradox, telling the dwarf, if he's to take revenge, he must be free. Peppered with sprightly triplets, the fire sprite's vocal begins by leaping up a third into a taunting Freya pulse capped with chord notes. After a quaver rest and over another quaver minim string chord bundle, he develops his thought by again rising a third into his own heroic resistance strophe to echo both god and dwarf. His following minim quaver rest stands aside for two chord note pulses in their unique rhythmic form bracketing the Scene 3-4 interlude to denote Alberich's capture. From there, after a static ash interval, Loge sinks on another hint of resignation, this time in taunting major mode, to lift through a third on a low ash interval, then repeat his uniquely ambivalent mix of defiance and reversal, its concluding plunging fifth on the word Frevel, Wotan's Scene 3 insult for Alberich, which the dwarf will soon hurl back at him. The fire god's comment launches the second and only return of his recent taunts, its construction identical to the first, though a denser woodwind mix augments its final three measures, lightened by strings whose turns are embellished with trill appoggiature, additional digs at the dwarf's repressed sexuality. However, Loge's vocal is quite changed. He descants atop cellos, which take its original, still intoning a pair of echoing phrases, but these now revolve on chord note oppositions, in effect teasing giant turns, each capped by pathetic descending sixths. He expands atop the orchestra's initial lift with three static notes to leap up an octave and down a sixth on the word Lösung, in contrast to Wotan's falling octave on the same term. Loge finishes his dig with a swift low-ash interval rising a third. This, the fire sprite's last comment until after the horde has been summoned from the depths, seems mere extraneous mockery which might as easily have been cut, yet the fire god's words are especially vital. Soll Rache dir frommen vor allem rate dich frei, drum sindst du auf Rache rasch ohne Säumen. Loge literally urges the dwarf to pursue a vendetta, stressing that, once free, Alberich can revenge himself as he likes, implying the ring would still be his, as the dwarf presently imagines it will be. The fire sprite naturally says this to goad quick acquisition of the horde, but together with his jeering tone, he also works to infuriate the dwarf, subtly urging him to more violently lay down the curse which is destined to hang over the entire drama, while Alberich pursues his own plans in its wake. In short, Loge seeks to facilitate Wotan's aims while covertly undermining them. After all, Rache is Hagen's war cry to bring the immortals' dreams forever crashing down. The dwarf asks what ransom is demanded, rising a fourth, then, after a quaver rest, falling a tritone into chagrin, ended on its own tritone. This crib of Loge's duplicitous syntax, Alberich sings over low strings in regular monotone pizzicato quaver thumps, his vocal bookended by tiny rising grace twitches on violas. Wotan names the horde boldly to an ascending air to fourth, followed after a quaver rest and a fifth descent by static notes from which he bounces down a third and up a fifth, in an exact repeat of his Ringlust module on the words Helles Gold. Under his vocal, low strings forsake their monotone to march spear-like down a pizzicato strophe of hyper-extended reverse melody notes, aptly capped with an abandonment triad, preceded by a sharp-graced violin quaver on the first note of a ring fragment outlined in minims by arco violas, cellos. A timpani roll continues beneath the first 5 measures of Alberich's reaction. Atop this, the dwarf snarls invective, with both of its belt-erb triads, the second a reverse ash interval. After a dotted minim rest, he lapses into a soft aside atop the unbroken timpani roll, musing how he'll get it all back with the ring's help. His swift vocal amounts to an echoing pair of phrases, the first capped in a low ash interval, as he moves through triplet static notes, the last a static ash interval, all dancing over strings which twice repeat the ring's final rising notes, then twice again extended into 4-note modules, the 2 most frequently heard versions of the melody notes. Put simply, the syntactic fragment which gives birth to both the horde, then expands to its longer version, which subtly underlines that Rheingold and the Nibelungs themselves arise from the Earth Mother's womb as part of her plans to which neither the dwarf tyrant nor Wotan are privy. Loge knows, of course, but isn't saying. And given each of these melody note pulses ends by falling a third to create 4 consecutive iterations of chagrin, that plan certainly isn't what either of the 2 enemies hope it will be. A cryptic and misunderstood touch follows. The timpani roll ends, and Alberich pursues his meditation singing Ein witzigung Vers, die Weise mich macht. His vocal, an echoing pair of static ash intervals ended by falling sevenths, while the strings beneath him outline a single pulse of scheming. Newman protests. A purely arbitrary musical figure is to be taken as symbolizing not merely the slyness of a particular person, but slyness in the abstract, a length to which we must decline to go with Wagner. Perhaps Newman is confused by the dwarf's belief in his own cunning, but it's Loge who's deceiving Alberich here, who's just encouraged the dwarf to think he'll keep the ring, an exercise the fire god has designed only so Wotan can seize it in the most infuriating way possible. As in all its occurrences, scheming invariably signals the fire god's subtle control, not merely of this one dwarf, or indeed of any individual character, but in any situation where the morpheme occurs. Wotan seeks only the ring, but Loge stalks bigger game. Nature requires not merely Alberich's physical body, but his heart. His dark core must be galvanized, and to effect that, the dwarf must first be utterly shattered, his hopes built up to the point where, once the ring is taken, they fall to their lowest ebb. Only then will he pursue the ghastly path of revenge which informs the rest of the tale, a pursuit that drives Wotan to his own fatal expedients. This initiates a new and crucial phase of the drama. Until the previous scene, that moment when Wotan places his foot on Alberich as toad, the success of the god's theft remains in doubt. Once the dwarf's caught, the ring is as good as Wotan's. Scene 4's cat and mouse seems gratuitous padding, but it shifts the work's focus to a concept vital to all that follows, that being what becomes of Alberich and his Nibelungs once he loses the ring. Loge pulls the strings that ruin the tyrant. The delusion of saving the ring adds to scheming a sense of futility, one which grows stronger as the scene unfolds. Emboldened by his thoughts, Alberich praises his new insight vocally to a pure world Ashenivil, his rising octave among the handful ever sung in the entire course of the epic. The irony is that his deception at Loge's hands brings the ring's power one step closer to its original fount. Following the strings on a Welterbe triad, the dwarf finishes his delusion with the heroic resistance module and, after chord notes, its retrograde, his own cry of defiance, as low strings glide up chromatic melody notes, the concise Erde-based proof of his fallacy. Adding to this irony, never mind slyly reinforcing Erde and Loge at work against them both, Wotan prods Alberich for the ransom over a stout reverse ash interval in low strings, singing a malicious echo of the tyrant's defiance. With another delicious twist, the dwarf asks that his hand be released to the Rhine Maiden's merry bounce with its own Welterbe triad. This he follows more ominously, promising he'll summon the horde to reverse melody notes. These have come to suggest his entire race's transformation, an idea that's caught Wotan's fancy as a possibility for himself. The dwarf launches on a dark semi-breve bassoon chord flavored by two horns as violins, cellos scamper down four demi-semi-quaver scales, the second and third swelled to quintuplets and capped by a fourth in sextuplets. After a stern minim held note, a marcato viola cello version finishes the idea by marching down on chromatic sextuplet quavers. It's another bit of Wagnerian Mickey Mousing, in this case depicting Alberich's hands unbound, which stage directors handle indifferently or not at all. Nor is it a minor point. Donington wonders why Alberich doesn't use the ring's power on his captors, and goes so far as to offer a rationale. His comment apparently put a flea in the ear of many directors over the last decades, who, though they reject Donington's explanation and pay little attention to the scalar twitches, do portray the gods taking care to restrain their captive in some way as if to prevent him unleashing his powers on them. The Copenhagen ring goes so far as opening scene 4 with the dwarf in chains, Loge preparing ghastly surgical equipment and a syringe. It's Wotan's placing a knife at Alberich's throat, all of which underlines the generally shared notion the ring has physical powers unrelated to symbolic greed, of which more in just a moment. Up to this point, outside the softest of timpani rolls, minimal woodwinds during Loge's taunts, and the horn bassoon semi-breve as Alberich is unbound, the string choir has carried the entire non-vocal weight of scene 4. It's a deliberate preparation for brass to appear, at last adding their cataclysmic impact to one of this first chapter's most striking and morphemically crucial sequences. According to the stage directions, Alberich raises the ring to his lips and secretly murmurs a command. As he does, the meter shifts to triple time, and the orchestra reproduces his Scene 3 invocation, scored almost exactly as when the dwarf threatens his slaves. The ring is followed by a strophe, here with dynamics eerily hushed, of what Cook dubs Power of the Ring. When that fades, cellos softly tap out 9 pulses of the Nibelung tattoo, bassoons quietly growling 3 horde strophes beneath the last 5 tattoos. The dwarf tyrant confirms he summoned his Nibelungs on a vocal made up almost entirely of static notes, only his first phrase bouncing up then down heroic fifths, followed by the tattoo's distinctive turn. As the horde sounds, his next line rattles that same one note, a static ash interval on its third pulse to end in a triplet ash interval capped by a rising erudite fourth. He then demands his release a cappella, rising a third into his defiant cry, to sync on chord notes and the Welt-Erbe triad, confirming he still cherishes his own racial hopes. Led by a falling demi-semiquaver scale on violas, Wotan denies him this boon until the ransom is paid, his a cappella vocals sinking a third, then, after a quaver rest, ascending on the same interval into a parody of Loge's taunts. As noted, Donington explains this sequence by rationalizing why, since the ring imbues its owner with power over all the world, Alberich doesn't force his captors to release him. Believing the ring is merely a symbol for the power of greed, allegorists may smile, but that view makes nonsense of the stage business. The dwarf clearly utilizes his ring as a functional device, his whispered spell triggering some kind of magic force which reaches all the way from the heights down into Nibelheim. Quite a distance if we're to credit the interludes leading to and from that underworld. Once there, the ring's sway not only mobilizes his slaves, but issues them precise instructions on what they're to do. It's one of those small details that reveals a much larger confusion, one which future producers would do well to address, rather than perpetuate by ignoring it. Thanks to long-standing disinterest in what constitutes the ring's practical functions, as if allegory's view is sufficient to explain all we need to know, this and other perplexing elements of the story render a satisfactory grasp of the overall work untenable, never mind its effective on-stage portrayal. For all that, the dwarves' appearance from the deep is one of the ring's watershed moments, several pivotal syntactic ideas coming together in a new way to clarify many of the drama's central ideas. Cook makes a sharp observation. This serves to demonstrate in the most concrete way the very real danger to the gods of Alberich's thwarted bid for power, since it actually enacts his threat to Wotan in Scene 3. The effect is of some monstrous evil emerging from underground to engulf the world. Wotan should still beware because, notwithstanding Alberich's personal downfall, the treasure has in fact risen to the daylight, and it, and particularly the ring, still represents an evil that threatens to engulf the world, beginning with Wotan himself. Formally speaking, the sequence develops 4 earlier passages in Scene 3, all concerned with the massing of Nibelung dwarves. This final expansion gathers into one sequence those modules connoting what Cook identifies as an evil that threatens to engulf the world. The allegorical school invariably classes this evil as greed, or the power of wealth, meaning the horde itself. But the stage effect is something quite different. The horde, meaning those stage props used to represent it, is of secondary interest. However cleverly this or that production displays the horde, it remains little more than a pile of cardboard props, or, moderately more successful in the case of Valencia, gold-clad bodies. What audiences mostly notice is a large group of Nibelungs outside of their underground world. In short, a stage picture unique in all the ring until Götterdämmerung, a vast faceless mass of individuals in the light of day and under the iron fist of a ruthless leader bent on carrying out his mission through them. The sonic design, overall a long crescendo to shattering climax, which then falls away in decrescendo, is primarily based on the Scene 2-3 interlude, fired with the rage of that passage in Scene 3 where Alberich drives in his slaves carrying their latest kärglich Höftchen of gold under the eyes of the gods. Here we're meant to take what they bring as the entire horde, which one presumes would hardly be kärglich. Given stage limitations, never mind the basic narrative difficulty that it only need be enough to later obscure Freya, what we've seen during that previous sequence is often exactly what they trundle about during the present one. Visually, the effect of this meager haul, set against the towering music which accompanies it, is either disappointing or slightly comical, another problem only future productions can solve if they even choose to do so. Sonically, however, things are quite different. Along with the sequence's greater length and maniacally insidious drive, its first major syntactic change is replacement of Rheinmaiden modules and Welterb triads with the Horde. A regular timpani pulse of Valhalla ash intervals begins each measure, while a soft tam-tam roll enters after the first two, growing ever louder as it approaches the segment's climax. After 4 cello Nibelung tattoo pulses mixed with an English horn, moaning chord notes, aka servitude, tubas join in with the Horde, bassoons supplying its reverse chord notes. After 4 Horde pulses, cello tattoo, and timpani unabated, tubas switch to 4 servitude iterations, each harmonically raised a third, bassoons augmenting the chord note strophes on English horn clarinets, their offset a subtle echo of Alberich's capture. It's here the dwarf's vocal re-enters to lament his shame by doubling the first 3 woodwind chord note iterations, a triple static ash interval in his first line, a reverse in his second, and a last static interval in his third. This initial portion of the long crescendo segues effortlessly into its next, a duplicate with heightened orchestration and one ingenious syntactic change. With a horn pedal throughout, contrabass's timpani bolster the cello tattoo, while trumpets, trombones take the Horde, woodwinds and tubas its reverse chord notes, and cymbals the world ash pulse, beginning each measure as the regular chord note iterations cease. Despite this subtle evidence the dwarf's power remains only in his slave's life force, Alberich fights wildly to seem in control by heckling them with pointless commands, one being for them not to look at him, stark evidence of his shame. After a static note scold, he ends his next 2 phrases by rising on thirds, a static ash interval beginning the second, reverse melody notes on the next, while his defiant threat comprises the 5th. He then barks, "Rasch da, rasch!" on a falling third in quavers and a single crotchet raised back up that third. As strings gradually augment the tattoo, this duplicate of the crescendo's first half brings back a rising chain of 4 servitude iterations on woodwinds, trombones, and contratuba, the other tubas and bass trumpet alone taking its offset version. Alberich's voice descants atop it as he orders his slaves back to the depths, 3 phrases infused with static triplets, then a plunging 5th tailed into his defiant threat. Strings and broad divisi unite on the tattoo's rhythm alone, as, fiercely punctuated by marcato chords in the higher brass, woodwinds and tubas howl the initial erta chords from Power of the Ring. Atop this, the dwarf utters his final threat, "Auf den Felsen folg ich euch nach," albeit neither they nor their tyrant yet know this is empty bluster. Fascinatingly, after bouncing up and down on thirds, his vocal line sketches an altered crib on that unique concatenation of his defiance, mixed with its retrograde inversion, a module learned from Loge. Though hardly noticed at this furious climax, this has intense meaning for the drama's future. Just as Scene 3 shows Wotan completely under Loge's thumb, Scene 4 suggests Alberich is equally enslaved by the fire god. In all events, the sequence reaches climax by finishing Power of the Ring with a dramatic shift in orchestration. Strings lapse into raging tremolos, timpani and tam-tam rolls crescendo, tubas and cymbals hammer out the Nibelung tattoo, while, with horn and woodwind chord support, trumpets, trombones roar the syntax's final module, its last note a massive crash in higher brass and tam-tam crotchets, sustained by a woodwind horn low brass dotted minim, high string tremolos, and low strings and timpani in continued tattoo strophes. Per the stage directions, and just as he does in Scene 3, Alberich kisses his ring and stretches it out commandingly, causing the Nibelungs to disappear, screaming. Unlike that earlier moment, however, the orchestra follows quite a different syntactic procedure to underline this latest retreat. An insidious tattoo pulse on contrabasses runs through it, cellos and timpani, tuba crotchets, strikes on the downbeat, tremolo violins, violas, and a contrabass tuba pedal. The focus here is on the more prominent legato chording in woodwinds as augmented by horns, which begins with an unmistakable pulse of reverse melody notes, a second iteration offset in the harmony. As direct inversions of their originals, these function as does the horde's immediately prior domination of the passage's crescendo. Now, these reversed melody notes imply the Nibelung's profoundly changed social-physical makeup in their retreat, with their repeated hints of sexual reproduction first mooted in Wotan's scene-to defense of his infidelities. As the pace quickens, slurring parses out erdichords, which spread across the passage through inner voices. The first pair's rhythmic pulse overlaps continuous reverse melody note strophes to drive the impetus towards the figure's swiftest rhythm. This syncs on extended reverse melody notes to continue through their most elongated module, the jumble of slurs overlapping harmonic pulses to create an overall rhythmic confusion equivalent to the dwarves' chaotic retreat. A veiled syntactic magic adds yet another layer, since this or that ear may parse this passage as a series of reverse melody notes, or baleful chord notes, or extended notes, or any combination of those. From another angle, the episode's final portion may be heard as a spear iteration, with a shade of resignation embedded. The dwarfish race's strength has just been punched home by their struggle up from Nibelheim, heavy laden with the gods' only rescue, the fruits of their own torments. In the same way, Nibelung modules dominate their retreat, to shatter the spear into a turmoil of sonic chunks, further evidence that even with Freya safe, the ring in hand, and his nemesis powerless, Wotan still faces the threat of Alberich's army of night, unleashed in the most unpredictable way. Contrabasses withdraw from the tattoo repetitions as horns low woodwinds layer 2 chord note pulses in their servitude context with 2 on trombone, producing that same rhythmic parallax as in Alberich's capture. The timpani shift to a hush roll as cellos alone continue the tattoo. Atop them, trombones breathe a final soft chord iteration that leaves only the timpani roll, cellos beginning the next 2 measures with isolated tattoo pulses on the first beat of 2 measures, strophes which attenuate in the sequence's final 2 measures to pizzicato crotchet strokes on the downbeat, the last of the dwarves vanishing. Alberich's booty in view, the key changes. The meter shifts back to common time, and he demands to be released. His a cappella vocal a welcome relief after the fierce assault by hordes and treasure. From 3 static notes, he sinks an fourth into melody notes, thus shaping this belief of his natural due into a strophe of his tyranny, its fourth relating it to Fricka's nobler version. Low woodwinds ghost the Tarnhelm's first coda as he demands it from Loge, jagging up then down fifths to complete an inverted ash interval, followed, after a quaver rest, by a pulse of chagrin. His next and echoing phrase is a rising-falling bounce on air to fourths into another inverted interval, finished with a chord note opposition and plunging fifth, all syntactic hints that he won't get what he wants. The fire sprite waves the bauble casually, divisi violins twice rushing up demi-semiquaver scales into pizzicato stings, while bassoons groan erdichords, Loge's mistress before all. A last piccolo scale, capped with a string pizzicato, suggests the Tarnhelm at last tossed on the horde, the legendary Schulte recording providing a sound effect for same. Leading on reverse chord notes, Loge's vocal falls into this final sting with a heroic melody note reversal, which he continues to chagrin, yet another crib of his ironic duplicity, puckishly capped with a graced string oboe quaver sting. Violins, violas sink from it in thirds to outline a weird truncation of the ring, and, doubling its fragment, the dwarf curses his thief to the initial Welterbe triad, his hopes for racial triumph not dead, the morpheme's rising notes crabbed into what's essentially a fading Erde chord reversal. With it, Alberich launches a new soft aside, formally an echo of his previous reverie over losing the horde. Unlike the ring's rising note strophes there, fraught with the syntax's minor seventh harmony, clarinets, bassoons, and thirds over a horn pedal replace the strings in a last Welterbe triad, contradicted by Wotan's ringlust, the dwarf's hold on his worldly power decaying even as he struggles to reassure himself. Denn der Alten mir schafft einen ander, noch halt ich die Macht der Mime gehorcht. He begins this swift triplet-fraught quasi-recitative by cautioning himself atop the ring distortion's reversed Erde chords. A minim rest isolates its reverse ash interval on a descending fifth, and after a dotted crotchet pause and a pair of static triplet quavers, he rises in thirds through another static triplet, creating an abandonment triad, retrograde of the Welterbe, whose potency the unwitting dwarf is about to lose. He tails out by sinking a third, only to hesitate on a disjointed chord note pulse, its lower interval detached between crotchet and quaver rests. On the third above, he follows this with a static triplet, ended by a tritone plunge. With another quaver pause, he rises on extended melody notes into another tritone, producing chagrin. Syntactic proof his is a vain fancy in these last minutes before Wotan robs him of that power. Once free of the ring's domination, of course, Mime can't be forced into crafting a second Tarnhelm. Moreover, though viewers don't yet know, Mime leaves Nibelheim to set up shop near Fafnir's lair with an entirely new breed under his yoke, one mighty enough to seize the ring for him. Clarinets, bassoons, in thirds tie that delusion to Alberich's next utterance by rising on crotchets in a hopeful scale, reminiscent of that six-note cell of vain hope which prefaces a full, scheming pulse, his voice doubling low strings in a hush as, deluded by Loge's subtle manipulation, the dwarf reconciles himself to the Tarnhelm's loss, his line replete with world-ash intervals. His phrase dips on the second seventh in an ominous reverse, to break with scheming through a more hopeful low, into a static triplet then a rising octave, heart of his aside's hopes, which leads to a static ash interval, its final